So in the last couple of weeks, we've seen Boeing idle production, more production temporarily. We've seen layoffs or furloughs from the likes of Textron, Spirit Aerosystems, GE, Triumph Group, to name a few. How would you categorize what we're seeing across aerospace and defense right now in the midst of coronavirus, given the fact that AIA does represent more than 300 companies?
It's been a squeeze. This virus follows what's been a tough time for the civil aviation market, which is why we've been working to try and find ways to provide relief to these companies and the enormous supply chain of some 17,000 companies that are a part of this ecosystem. We've been focused with our members on sort of three lines of effort since this virus became apparent to us. The first, of course, is protecting the health and the economic welfare of the workforce, which is vital to the industry. The second is looking for ways, both inside the stimulus mechanism and outside, to inject capital liquidity into the system as a tool to get through this crisis. So again, this enormous ecosystem is ready to start meeting the demand when we get through the virus. And the third is the companies are looking for ways and coming up with some interesting approaches on how to help their communities, and also ways that they could combat the virus in doing things that they weren't doing before.
Yeah, and certainly there's a lot of focus right now on this $2 trillion aid package that just passed and got signed into law, and what that will mean for some of these companies that are deemed essential to national security. Whether Boeing, by the way, taps into some of that fiscal lifeline or not. But in the meantime, you also have the DoD, you have NASA that are continuing to award contracts right now. And based on some of my conversations with officials, do so perhaps even more quickly than they otherwise would have to keep getting cash into the hands of some of these companies. How would you categorize what's playing out, particularly on the defense and space side?
Well, the government's doing an amazing job to try and inject that capital, that investment into the supply chain, into the private sector side. The best way to keep the supply chain whole is to keep it working. And so on the defense and space side, that money is budgeted, appropriated, authorized. We have been working with those agencies to use tools they already have or to get new tools from Congress in order to keep those funds obligated and moving faster than they might have otherwise, to get it into the supply chain and try and mitigate any damage or perturbations that might be coming as a result of the virus. Defense
Production Act is getting a lot of attention right now, given the fact that President Trump has referenced it. There was the beginnings of an invocation of it on Friday as well. How does that affect this manufacturing base and those companies that you represent, and how does it play out from a DoD standpoint?
Well, I think it's actually larger than DoD and than defense. It has that name because it was a series of tools that were imagined in case we were at war. And so the focus maybe is in a little bit different direction than it might have been if we're at war. I think, the government is focused on gathering as many supplies as it can that exist in warehouses and stockpiles and so forth. Second, seeing what they need that they can get more of from existing manufacturers like Honeywell and 3M and the N95 mask. And then third is thinking about ways that maybe manufacturers can retool. That's a lot more complicated to think through and take time to do it. But we're already seeing examples of industry stepping up and doing that independent of the Defense Production Act. Boeing is using 3D printing to make face masks. Leonardo DRS is using adaptive manufacturing to create a plastic valve that can convert a certain scuba mask into a respirator. And so companies are doing this on their own, independent of the Defense Production Act.
Yeah, and finally, I want to get your thoughts on what we're seeing start to play out in space as well right now. We had OneWeb, which is backed by SoftBank, file for bankruptcy over the weekend. One of the biggest satellite startups out there, Bigelow Aerospace as well, idled its operations, let go of its staff. We've talked so much about this new emerging space race, this new space economy. Is there more pain to be had within this piece of the aerospace and defense puzzle?
Well, I don't think so, more than in any other piece. The defense side, as we talked about, has a lot of mechanisms to keep that liquidity, to keep that cash flow going through. The civil aviation side is definitely struggling. This stimulus will help by injecting money into that supply chain. 70% of anything that goes to Boeing, for example, goes right into that supply chain. It's an enormous part of what makes civil aviation. On the space side, it's still a very robust and competitive environment as the commercial space sector grows, but it is still nascent, and so they're figuring out what the market is. And certainly there'll be perturbations because of this virus. It's impacting the supply chain, which is shared among all three of those sectors: space, civil aviation, and defense. And we'll have to see how that plays out over the course of this crisis.